Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute and get going. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Boggs. I'm the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance, and we are very grateful that you have decided to spend your beautiful June evening talking about zoning. We think it's an important topic, but we also know that it's really nice outside. It's hard to recall a time over the 20 years that I have been in Connecticut when zoning has gotten so much attention. We've seen a real awakening on issues of race all around the state. Our organization has received an amazing number of calls over the last several months from people in predominantly white suburban communities asking for assistance on unraveling structures of racism, and particularly taking a hard look at their zoning. So we're really grateful for that, and it's in part those kinds of calls that inspired us to write and now today issue a new report, Zoning for Equity, Identifying Planning and Zoning Barriers to Affordable Housing, which is available on our website, and I think will be in the chat. And the goal of this report really is to better understand the planning and zoning rules and policies limiting the development of mixed income housing with affordable units, and provide some guidance to local advocates interested in advocating for changes in their town. There's much more to be done. This is just the first volume of what we think will be several, and there are lots of other issues to address within the report. And we won't get to everything that is needed to address these issues in towns tonight, but this is a start. Part of the reason we think this is so important is because of the evidence that has come to light over the last few years over the importance of where people live and neighborhood, and the need to ensure that every neighborhood is a neighborhood that is thriving and is able to sort of do right by kids. We also know that if we have government systems that are essentially mandating poverty concentration, we are creating all kinds of problems for communities that historically have been communities of color and limiting choices for, in particular, Black and Latino families elsewhere. If we do this right, we can take away the power of slumlords. We can allow for community-led, equitable revitalization in places that are struggling. We can strengthen communities, we can strengthen our economy, and ultimately we can really tackle racism and prejudice. So with that introduction, I'll just briefly review what our agenda will be tonight. I'm going to do a quick zoning 101 and then turn the program over to Roger Maldonado, who is our staff attorney. And I think bios are available in a program booklet. Then we will move to, Roger will review our review of 12 different towns that we have assessed, really to just start to see the themes that pop up in the state around restrictive zoning. And then we'll turn over to our expert panel, and I will quickly just now review who they are so we can jump right into that when we get there. So we have with us tonight Professor John Britton, who is a member of the faculty at the David Clark School of Law at the University of the District of Columbia. He has held a number of academic appointments, including as Dean of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University and as a professor at the University of Connecticut School of Law. With many deep Connecticut connections, he has undertaken a range of civil rights work, including with the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the American Civil Liberties Union. Professor Britton was one of the attorneys on the Sheff versus O'Neill school desegregation litigation. He and another one of our panelists, Phil Tegler, were part of the group to found the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and he's also on the advisory board for Open Communities Alliance. We also have with us today Cheryl Sharp, who is the Deputy Director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, where she has addressed civil rights issues for almost 3 decades. She is a graduate of Wesleyan University and the University of Connecticut School of Law. And last but not least, we have Phil Tegler, who is the Executive Director of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, a position he's held for almost 2 decades. Prior to joining PRAC, Mr. Tegler was the legal director at the Connecticut ACLU, where he worked on numerous housing and education-related matters, including the Sheff versus O'Neill case. He's the author of a body of articles and publications exploring the intersection of race and poverty, and Mr. Tegler is a graduate of Harvard College and Columbia Law School. As you will note, our panelists today are really focused on the civil rights aspect of this work. As we move forward, we are excited to bring in additional voices of town planners and zoning commission members and developers and members from all different kinds of communities. So we look forward to those future events, and I will jump into the Zoning 101 session now. Okay, well, welcome again. And for those of you who don't know Open Communities Alliance, we're a statewide civil rights organization that's really working to address the fact that Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country. We do work with a coalition, and we'd welcome you to be part of it. And I've included the link here, but it's also on our website. Part of how we come to this is a real concern about what we think of as an affordable housing crisis in the state. The state has the 9th highest housing wage in the nation, meaning a family would have to work 99 hours a week at minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. We've done our own research into the need for affordable housing and discovered that the state is missing 135,000 units of affordable housing, which should be created over the next 10 years. Now, this estimate is not just based on a total number of families paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. It's actually a more conservative estimate. We're looking at families who are at 30% of area median income. That's about $30,000 a year for a family of 4, paying more than half of that towards housing costs. And that's 135,000 families. And this does not include families who are already getting government help with housing. We also are aware that there's a segregation crisis in the state. On this map, the dark brown reddish areas are places that are in the top 10% of segregated areas nationally. You can see Connecticut is right up there and more segregated than any place in the South. The result is that we have a real disparity of opportunity. I'm going to fly through these slides because I know many of you have seen them already, but we have looked at and assessed opportunity in every census tract in the state, looking at education, educational indicators, employment indicators, and neighborhood indicators like crime rates and homeownership rates. And we've come up with a map like this, where the dark orange are places that are very high in opportunity with high-performing schools and high levels of homeownership. The lightly shaded areas are places that are really struggling, that need more investment, but also families who live there, some of whom, not all of whom, really would like some alternative choices. We can map this with where families of color are living and see a real pattern. Black and Latino families are disproportionately living in those lower opportunity areas. 74% of Blacks and 68% of Latinos. That's true for only 25% of whites and 32% of Asians. This has all kinds of implications across other issue areas like education, employment, incarceration, and health. It also has real implications, along with a lot of other factors, for income and wealth. In Connecticut, Blacks and Latinos are earning half or less on average than whites, and across the country have a tenth or less of the wealth. And all of this, of course, feeds into what can be afforded in terms of housing. And this is why affordable housing becomes so critical. How we got here, I'm not going to go into great detail on this. There's been a lot of documentation of the government role and in creating segregation through very explicit policies. And I recommend to you this book, The Color of Law. All right, zoning 101. I think that the first place to start with zoning is to understand the legal underpinnings of our zoning laws in our state. And the first element of that is our Zoning Enabling Act, which is Connecticut General Statute 8-2. There are also some planning mandates that go along with that and share the same language with regard to affordable housing. And the one to look at is Connecticut General Statute 8-23. These laws very clearly encourage the development of multifamily dwellings to meet the regional need of affordable housing, and also to, and this is a shall, these towns shall promote housing choice and economic diversity, including housing for both low and moderate income households. 8-2 is the way that the state, that is the entity that starts with the zoning power, delegates it out to towns. There are also federal and state fair housing laws that are relevant because there's a disparate effect of exclusionary zoning on Black and Latino families and other groups too that are covered by those laws. There's a state constitution provision that is an anti-segregation provision that is relevant here. And lastly, there's something called the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which I'm only pointing out because it's actually not a law that directly affects towns. It applies to towns in a vacuum. It only applies to towns if a developer comes along with an affordable housing proposal that gets rejected. The developer then has a leg up in court because of the law. So there's nothing standalone that is giving towns direction on what to do in terms of affordable housing creation beyond what's in the Zoning Enabling Act and these other provisions. The next thing to understand about zoning is just the difference between planning and zoning. Planning, as you could probably guess, is just this notion of these overarching goals and strategies and a vision for the town. These should be articulated under state law in the plan of conservation and development that every town has to do every 10 years. Zoning is a set of regulations that govern what can and cannot be built in town, how long, or how it must be built, where it can go in town, and these kinds of things are outlined in the municipal zoning ordinance. Many towns have established a joint planning and zoning commission rather than having these as two separate bodies, and that's how we'll be talking about them in this presentation. Types of approvals. This is really important when thinking about where multifamily housing and other kinds of affordable housing can go. So the first notion here is this idea of something that can be built as of right or by right. This is this notion that probably the only approval you need to get is some kind of administrative approval from the town. You don't need to go through a public hearing. You probably just need to get what's called a zoning permit. When you think of most single family homes in Connecticut, they are generally as of right within the zone where they're located. The next concept is this idea of a special permit or special exception. These are really the same things. Zoning ordinances spell out what uses are allowed.
Sorry, folks, some quick technical difficulties. Erin's getting reconnected.
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that, everyone. I think that's just what happens in this crazy world of connecting virtually. All right, I'm going to just try to scoot back to where I was. All right, so we were on special permits and zoning, special exceptions and zoning permits. So these really, what will happen with zoning is it will spell out what is allowed by right, and then it will spell out things that are allowed if you get a special, sort of a special permission through a special permit or special exception. And that comes through from the Planning and Zoning Commission, and usually has to include a public hearing and a site plan, which can be expensive. And when it comes to multifamily housing, it usually also includes all kinds of additional rules. An example of this is maybe adding a dentist office into a home residence. The last thing I wanted to mention is a building permit, and that really isn't connected to zoning, but it's another point at which a developer will have to interact with the town. And that really is just a permit that ensures that the construction of a permitted use meets the basic building and aesthetic requirements. So the next concept is this concept of zoning districts, which I think many people might be familiar with. This is just this notion that different parts of town will be designated by the Planning and Zoning Commission for different uses. Some examples include residential zones. Those are usually referred to in zoning codes as R and then a number. So R1, R2, maybe R20, R40. There will be in the ordinance a description of what is allowed as a right and then what is allowed as a special permit. Usually in residential zones, lots of residential zones, even with a special permit, you're not allowed to put in multifamily housing. Other kinds of zones include agricultural zones, open space or reserved land, commercial or business zones, industrial zones, office zones, or mixed use or town center zones. These usually allow both residential and commercial uses. And then there's this notion of these specialized zones, like an overlay zone, zones that can be superimposed on top of other zones and permit special uses. So in this map, you can see there's regular zoning, and then in that red box, a special overlay zone has been imposed. There are also other kinds of special zones like planned development, special or floating zones. These are targeted zones that could include just a single lot, or they could include several lots to promote a certain use. And they usually also require approval by the Zoning Commission. There's this area of square footage versus acres. This is something, if you're new to looking at a zoning ordinance, this is going to drive you crazy unless you have this handy dandy chart, or you already are very familiar with these kinds of measurements. But just to give people a little context, a quarter acre is about 10,000, 11,000 square feet, and it's about the size of 4 tennis courts. Half an acre, 8 tennis courts, about 21, 22,000 square feet. 1 acre is 43,000 square feet and change, about 75% of a football field. And 2 acres is 87,000 square feet, and that's about 1.5 football fields. So I think it's really important when we get into Roger's discussion of what we found in our assessments to understand the scope of the land that we're talking about. Like 1.5 football fields, 2 acres is really quite large. Then there's the kinds of housing that can be built, single family homes. I think people really know what that is. Those are, individual and separated residents. The bigger the lot that it's required to go on, the more expensive it's going to be. And then there's multifamily housing, which can come in lots of different forms: duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, and more. One important thing to know if you're working in a community and want to make sure that you have real balance in where, the income targeting for affordable housing, is that for the major government programs that help build mixed income housing with affordable units that are truly affordable to low income families, those programs don't make sense for developers to do until usually they have at least 30 units and probably more like 50 units. So if you're looking at your town zoning and there's no place to do that kind of housing, it's going to be very hard to have the full range of incomes represented in your community. Then there's this notion of density. This is often expressed in the number of dwellings per acre. And another little code that we see a lot in these zoning ordinances is DU per AC, so dwelling units per acre. And it goes all the way from single family homes that might be on 1 or 2 acres all the way up to 30 units on an acre. And then there's this notion of minimum lot size, the smallest area of land allowed for the use within the zone, like 1 unit per acre, which is different, and this is something that might come up in Roger's discussion, from parcel size, which is the total amount of land needed for an entire use, like a housing development. So you could have a requirement for a housing development that the parcel be 5 acres with a minimum lot size of 2 homes per acre. So I'm going to actually stop right there and turn it over to Roger, who hopefully will not have computer issues like I did. And Roger, take it away.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all virtually here on Zoom. Let me just start sharing my screen and we can get underway. I appear to not have screen sharing issues, so we are having our screen sharing abilities right now. So minor hiccup, but hopefully that can be fixed quickly.
We'll get that fixed.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can I go into slideshow? Okay, so as Aaron mentioned, and I hope you can all see my slides, I'm going to be giving a little background on the report. Aaron covered some of my early stuff, so I can go through it, past that, and move on to, so how did we pick the towns that we're looking at really quickly? You'll see that we have 12 towns included in our study. They are from the 4 largest counties in Connecticut, New Haven, Hartford, and Fairfield, and they represent a diversity of towns in terms of some of these are actually quite large. Fairfield is almost the size of a small city, and others are more, you'd think of them more as maybe rural towns. But they have several things in common, and one of them is that they're quite segregated. These range, though I've given Madison data there to show you just how stark this can really be. It is hardly the only one that has such a dominance of white families and an absence of families of color in the town. These towns also sometimes are segregated when you look at them compared to their neighbors, who tend to be far more diverse. So Southington is surrounded by quite a few cities, or right near them. And while it might be a little burdensome to look across the map or across the chart, you can see pretty quickly that it is far whiter and far less Black and Hispanic than all of the areas around it. These towns are also segregated in terms of income. We have some extremely wealthy towns here, as I've highlighted a couple here. Westport is particularly striking in that its median household income is double that of even our wealthiest county in Fairfield County. Critically, these towns all lack affordable housing. Some of that is something that you could see very clearly, even through a passing look at the data on these towns. A $1.5 million home value is hard to miss, but some of them require a little bit more care. For example, the town of Berlin, which if you look at in the aggregate, it's affordable housing. It appears to be closer to some of the figures that are set by that 830G statute that Aaron mentioned. But when you remove senior housing or age-restricted housing that can't be occupied by families, and you remove rental housing, there's less than 2% of the housing stock in the town that's available to the many, many, many people across our state in need of rental housing for families. So those are our towns. And now just to briefly touch on what we were trying to accomplish, I think Aaron spoke to this a bit, but this report is really meant to illustrate impediments, not just in zoning, but also in planning. And I'll get back to that in a second, as well as look at some of the existing policies that are in place to promote density and multifamily and affordable housing and how they may not be quite sufficient. And then it is meant to be a diagnostic tool that will help towns and advocates therein think about how they can make changes to improve access to all of the opportunities they have to offer. So without further ado, I'll jump into what we actually found. So the first big lesson that we came to was that you really do need to look at planning, not just at zoning. I've presented here a map from the plan of conservation and development for the town of Ridgefield, which is one that we see across a lot of towns, a future land use plan. And what you'll notice is that most of the map is colored white with some little yellow areas and a very, very little bit of orange and 3 little blue circles. And those are the areas, the blue circles are the areas that Ridgefield has targeted as potential places for further density, or appears to have. And it really speaks to how much of town through planning is targeted towards single family. And you have that comment here that this is actually from an earlier POCD, Plan of Conservation and Development, that Ridgefield should always be a single family residential town in its character. You also see in planning a concerted effort to ensure that what multifamily is built is separate from single family neighborhoods. And oftentimes multifamily and affordable housing is even characterized as a threat. The map from the town of Berlin helps show just how separate these uses can be from the rest of town. The second major lesson is that multifamily housing consistently is harder to build than single family housing. Usually there are huge swaths of town where single family housing is allowed as of right, which, as Aaron explained, means without having to seek the Planning and Zoning Commission approval, without having to go through that public hearing process. Whereas multifamily housing is often nowhere given that same latitude, or only in very, very small areas of town. The map that you see here, everything that is beige are areas which are just single family as of right. And there are some select orange areas which were targeted towards multifamily in Avon. There's also some towns which distinguish between multifamily forms and tend to be more permissive of lower scale multifamily. So in the town of Southbury, 2-family is actually allowed as of right through a lot of town, but nothing above that. And while there are many things that lead into how a town's actual housing stock shakes up, it is noteworthy that of the various multifamily uses in town, single family, 2-family is the only one that surpasses the state in certain regards. It overperforms. So perhaps not coincidentally that is the one that the town is most permissive towards. Then the other way that you see this is that this becomes a major problem is because of the requirements for a public hearing that come along with the special permit process. There is unfortunately an opportunity for opposition that can prove fatal to affordable housing proposals. I've pulled a couple of quotes here, but there's others in the report, and I'll just note that in general, because of the limits of time, this is a 1,000-foot survey. So I encourage you to take a look at the more detailed report for some more information. But these towns know that these processes can present major problems to multifamily and affordable housing proposals, as shown here. So the last piece that I want to hit on with regards to the planning piece is that planning oftentimes will favor, this is actually supposed to be Bertels. It says bureaucratic hurdles. It says planning, but both are applicable. there's often a distinction that is drawn between multifamily housing that's open to everyone and multifamily housing and affordable housing that is age restricted. In the town of North Haven, the areas that are orange or orange-ish on this map are all areas where age-restricted affordable housing can be built above 3 units, but not non-age restricted unless you invoke an overlay zone, which can be very, very complicated for the reasons Aaron described. The third major lesson is that there's just not a lot of land in the towns that we looked at that is set aside for multifamily housing. There are 2 maps side by side here that really put that into stark relief. On the left is the town of Fairfield. It gets a little cluttered with the parcel lines, but basically the only areas where you can have multifamily housing are along the highway. That's kind of the snake towards the bottom. The huge green areas to the north, that's all single family. And it's a little easier to see in Southington, where everything that is green, that is white, and that is yellow, those are single family areas. And it's the little bit of orange in the middle, again, around sort of near 84, that you have multifamily able to be built. You also tend to see towns concentrate multifamily around areas that are non-residential, such as commercial centers or transit hubs. In the town of Madison, they actively seek to discourage multifamily everywhere other than Madison Center, which is the tiny little blue triangle there. And regardless, everything north of 95, which is the vast majority of town, is a single family area, with below being the only areas where you see more opportunity for multifamily development in substance. So moving to another piece that Aaron touched on, minimum lot and parcel sizes. Starting with minimum lots, we see a lot of large lot single family zoning. Everything in yellow in the town of Orange requires 60,000 square feet minimum, about 1.5 acres, which is almost the entirety of town. And that invariably drives up costs, both by virtue of driving up property values and just gobbling up a lot of land. You also sometimes see incredible increases in minimum lot sizes when you move from single family to multifamily housing. As you can see here in Berlin, that approaches 19 times in certain areas, from 3 acres to 60 acres of minimum lot size. Of a piece with lot size considerations are the really strict limits on density that we see across towns. And these come in myriad forms. The most common is a cap on the number of units per acre, but we also see units per building. We sometimes see units per square foot of open space, or units per square foot of commercial floor area if you have above retail housing as that's a multifamily that's permitted. And then we have some truly extraordinary examples, such as numerical caps of the amount of housing that can be built throughout an entire zone, or amount of that housing in that zone that can be built within a period of time. The town of Southbury presents some examples there where their planned development districts are capped at 250 units, or about that, might be 285. And there are also only certain percentage of that can be built within any half-decade period. So another recurring theme that I think would be familiar to many of you is that multifamily is frequently tied to infrastructure. I have side by side here the sewer map for the town of Ridgefield and the planned opportunity district map from their plan of conservation and development. And you'll note that the blue areas on the right, which is that opportunity map, are almost exactly coterminous with the areas in blue on the left, which is where there is existing sewer service. And part of the concern is not just that it's tied to such a narrow part of town, but that towns are committed to ensuring that those areas don't expand. In the town of Orange, almost the entire area, which if I were to go back, you'll see lines up with that yellow single family area, is a planned sewer avoidance area where they are committed to not expanding sewer service. It's not the only form, I should say, of infrastructural constraints. You'll also see transit constraints where certain districts have to be within a certain distance from a hub or abutting a major roadway. And these are all ways that you really winnow down the areas of town where you can build multifamily and affordable housing. I'm a little short on time, so I'm going to fly through these last ones, but there's a major recurring problem that we see of multifamily and affordable housing opportunities being targeted towards populations other than families. The most frequent example is forms of elderly housing dominating the use of the permitted multifamily uses within a town, or being given preferential treatments such as allowing for more units per building or more units per acre, or being the only type of multifamily that's permitted within a certain area, as we discussed a little bit earlier. But there are also other ways that families have a harder time. You'll have zones that ban outright units above a certain number of bedrooms, or you'll have restrictions on the percentage of the number of bedrooms within a district, or units within a district that can be above bedrooms, usually something as low as two-bedroom households. So it really becomes quite difficult for families in need of housing. And this is reflected in planning. In Fairfield, their transit-oriented development district is focused on empty nesters. It's focused on young families. And we see that a lot. Singles, groups of people who are unlikely to have children, things of that nature. The last thing I'd want to touch on of the major lessons was that we saw a bunch of approaches that unfortunately that towns rely on heavily, but unfortunately don't do enough. Accessory dwelling units was a major recurring theme across these towns, often through recent reforms to permit them. It's not that accessory dwelling units shouldn't be part of the puzzle. It's that there is perhaps an undue reliance upon them as a major part of the solution, when in almost all cases, they're required to have owner occupancy. They're very small, oftentimes capped at the number of occupants or the number of rooms to effectively 2 or 3 people. And there's no requirements of things like affirmative marketing procedures. So to the extent that any get built, which it's unclear how many would be, there's no guarantees that they will be effective, affordable housing provisions. But this wasn't the only form that we encountered. We saw a number of towns that created affordable districts, but restricted them to either single family usage or homeownership, which is unlikely to be able to reach as far in terms of affordability, and therefore can cut off a major segment of the population. There, just really quickly, a couple of unique things that we saw in the town of Madison. There, for its affordable housing district, there is a preference system whereby if you are a resident of the town of Madison, you essentially get first shot at the units that might be generated before non-residents, with some exceptions for employees. Given the racial dynamics I highlighted at the beginning, this is a deeply concerning provision. And then we saw in a couple of towns some strange provisions where the affordable housing or multifamily metric disappeared, either after a certain amount of time or once a certain threshold was hit, such as most notably if the 830G exemption was reached. So I'm going to now pass it back over to Erin, who I believe is going to talk about some next steps.
Yeah, so I think the question then becomes, what do we do? And this is a much longer conversation. Actually, Roger, you can keep your presentation up.
Yep.
Yeah. If you could go back to the slides at the end, that would be great. What should we do? And this is a longer conversation that we'll continue to have over time. But we have mapped out a few steps that people in towns who are interested in tackling this in a variety of ways could start taking. One is partly coming to things like this and lots of others that are happening around the state, so sort of self-education and self-reflection. Then there's thinking about how this kind of information might be helpful to other people in your community and creating opportunities to share it. Then there's thinking a little bit about how to change systems within your town. Look at actually reviewing your town's zoning policies, maybe extending a little further beyond zoning, maybe what's going on with school culture. And that's partly why we offer this first volume of the report, is so people can see what the trends are, at least in the towns that we've started with, and see if maybe those same things are happening in your town. And for people in the towns we reviewed, we've gone a long way in reviewing what's going on in your town. And then in communities with a real dearth of affordable homes, think about actually getting active on this, looking to initiate a development getting built, or think about really changing your zoning. And then the last thing I want to mention as an action step is this notion of fair share planning and zoning. And Roger, if you could go to the next slide. As many of you know, House Bill 6611 was proposed for the first time this year, and we were glad to see that it passed the Planning and Development Committee, and it died in judiciary due to basically a filibuster threat, even though it had the votes to continue on. What this proposes is that we assess the number of affordable housing units that the state needs. We allocate those fairly out to every single town, with the exception of towns that are at 20% poverty or greater, and then establish a planning and enforcement process to be sure that the housing is produced. And this is something that can be both a state policy, but it can also be a standard that you could use in your own town to guide your planning process and your rezoning process. In some cases, these numbers are really serious numbers for towns. And that's because the problem is really serious and the disparity is really serious. In other towns, the number is easily accomplished in actually on short order. And for those towns especially, I think incorporating it into your planning and zoning would be very, very easy. And I think with that, we're going to move on to some questions for our panelists. All right, so once again, we have Professor John Britton, we have Cheryl Sharp and Phil Tegler, and I think I'm going to start with John. Or Professor Britton, if you could provide us with a little historical context, that would be, I think, helpful to the discussion. How have the sort of high-level findings of this report squared up with your experience growing up in Fairfield County and then later doing all the various civil rights work that you did in the state, including on education and zoning? We'd appreciate your thoughts.
Good evening, everyone, in particular to you, Aaron, and the Open Communities Alliance, and the publication of your report on zoning for equity, barriers to affordable housing. And Roger, that was a wonderful presentation. I'm a native nutmaker, born and raised in Connecticut back in 1944. I've seen both wealth and poverty. My parents were servants for Candler Dobbs, the president and CEO of the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. And they moved from Atlanta, Georgia to New York and then to Saugatuck, Connecticut. I lived above a garage with 5 doors and a fleet of precious cars. And that was my access to wealth and to communities that still exist in Connecticut today. Dobbs lost his fame and fortune due to alcoholism and divorce, but as he was leaving, he helped my parents buy a home in Norwalk, Connecticut. And I always say a white person went to look for a house where white people live. And so they gave a second mortgage to help my parents pay the down payment and the initial opening for the home, closing for the home. And I went to Winnie Park High School in Norwalk, surrounded by Westport and Weston and Saugatuck, all the way down to Old Greenwich and Greenwich, all the way up to Fairfield and Stratford, all wealth. And I was the only Black at this school because the white person had bought a house for my parents, Black people, and they bought it in a white neighborhood. So for 5 years, I was a single Black student at Winnie Park High School in Norwalk that had many other African Americans other part of the town. I later went off to college, went off to law school, went to Mississippi, became a civil rights lawyer, and came back to Connecticut and joined the faculty of UConn. And I teamed up with Phil Tegler, another panelist here, Martha Stone, who is one of the leading lawyers in the continuing Chef versus O'Neill segregation case. And when we first brought the case, we looked at housing and its relationship to segregation in education. Housing segregation is the #1 cause of school segregation, particularly when the school boundary lines are drawn around neighborhoods. And in our case, we had basically 4 counts. One was the desegregation count. We call it the Brown versus Board of Education count. We had a new count in that case in the era of the 1980s, looking at the high concentration of poverty and its impact upon communities, and particularly in education. And we had a very new theory that the high concentration of places like Hartford, Connecticut, New Haven, and Bridgeport, with 85 and 90% non-white students and nearly 80-90% poverty, had such an impact upon equal educational opportunities that it was a violation of the Connecticut State Constitution Education Clause. And the court accepted it, and we made it all the way to trial through it. But they picked the Brown segregation count, but they did acknowledge that we had a good claim too for the poverty. And we had this third count in which we claimed that the state of Connecticut engaged in housing discrimination, which caused the segregation. The discovery for it would have persisted perhaps a longer time than it did. So we had to choose between going to trial on what we had, including some other administrative clauses, counts rather, in the case, or dropping the housing count. And we dropped the housing count. We went on with the rest. The history is well known, just a good recent settlement, finally, between the state of Connecticut and the chef plaintiffs in 2020, 2019. And the housing, though, still exists. I say, with some embarrassment, some of my other colleagues don't agree, but that was the worst mistake I ever made, of dropping that housing count and its impact now, and then too, on fair and affordable housing in Connecticut. So I've lived it, and I've litigated it, and I'm so proud of groups like the Communities Conference and others who are still battling today. And zoning is one of the main causes. You mentioned the book by Rothstein, The Color of Law, and I'm teaching Rothstein's book in my Civil and Human Rights seminar this summer. And I'm defying those states that don't want to teach critical race theory, or don't want to discuss institutional racism, structural racism, things like that. And I'm teaching my students how to use critical race theory jurisprudence to study racism. And zoning is a classic example of structural racism when it's set aside on these so-called non-racial grounds that has significant racial impact.
All right, thank you, John. That is fantastic perspective to get, and actually segues nicely into what I wanted to ask Cheryl about, which is, the CHRO just released a really important report on zoning. And I guess I have a 2-part question for Cheryl. One is, how do the conclusions and findings of the CHRO's report, Connecticut Zoning and Discrimination, match up with the high level information you just heard about zoning for equity? And then how do you see the findings of these reports fitting into the overall history of segregation and the government's involvement with it?
Let me start by saying good evening. I am honored and humbled to be a part of this panel. And hello, Professor John Britton was one of my professors in law school. So I cannot believe I've made it to a point where I'm actually sitting on a panel with him and not listening in only. The Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities did issue a report. We are taking on zoning. It is an issue in our cases. We have several cases that have been filed now that we are currently litigating that involve zoning, and we need to fan out. The zoning laws and regulations, while some may be neutral on their face, they are having this disparate impact and effect on Black and Brown communities, on Black people and Latinx people. And it is leaking into not only housing, but educational opportunity. Most of our wealth in this country comes from home ownership, right? And the equity that we have in our homes that then allows us to create generational wealth. And because there are sectors of our population who were denied the opportunity to own homes due to de jure segregation, it's just, I mean, it's structural, systemic racism that we have to dismantle immediately. I know some people are of the mind that we need to take incremental steps, but it's been hundreds of years of discrimination that has led us to be one of the most segregated states in our nation. I think that, going to your question squarely, our reports line up nicely because we're looking at the historical discrimination that has occurred in the areas that are affected, such as, you know, housing and discrimination, and how zoning laws have affected access to low-income families as well. You took 12 towns, I believe, and evaluated them and what was happening there, and our data showed a similar outcome, and it is the state's responsibility. And I'm coming from a state agency, and I'm putting on record that it is the state's responsibility, as well as the municipality's responsibility, to unearth the problem and to deal with it head on. And I think both of our reports say that. Your report gives recommendations, and the commission's report gives some of the same recommendations for changing outcomes for families and for people living in Connecticut, because that is what is important. It's not about the numbers. It really is about the people attached to the numbers. It's about the households being adversely affected. It's about the households who can't find housing, affordable housing, people with children, and people don't want them in their dwelling. And the government should not and can no longer participate in creating all of these barriers to affordable housing. So I think that I see as an agency a lot of work together ahead that we have to do with open communities, because we have to create them, right? While we do need to invest in low-income communities, because some people want to stay where they are, and we have to have an acknowledgement of that. And so there has to be some reinvestment and some investment in those communities. There also needs to be a portability, because there are people who want to be in high opportunity areas and they're denied that opportunity. And so I think that we are speaking the same language. Both organizations, one being a state government and the other being a nonprofit. And I see opportunities for us to work together to solve this problem. We're looking, the reason why, one of the major reasons why we asked for our staff, and I'm so thankful to the staff, they put in so much work in developing this report and developed it with a lot of care and looking at the statistics, because this is such an important issue and we need to take action. So at this point, we're evaluating the data, and your report, you said, how can we use your report, or that's my interpretation of what you're saying. We are going to use your report to determine whether or not we should have some commission-initiated complaints of discrimination against the municipalities potentially, or against state agencies involved in perpetuating the discrimination that is occurring. And we're hoping to partner with you on that. And I know lawsuits are difficult, but I think that is what changes things. Like we have to go back to how Thurgood Marshall did things. When there was an issue, there was a lawsuit, and then there was some action. And so that is what we are currently in the process of doing. And your report only helps us because before we can do a commission-initiated complaint, we have to establish that there's some evidence to show that there is a discriminatory effect, or that there's some disparate treatment.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. And Actually, the notion of the spillover effects that you were alluding to earlier is one question that I wanted to put to Phil. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of exclusionary zoning on things like schools, the location of subsidized housing, and poverty concentration? Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
Sure. I think I'd like to first, to the extent there are any lawyers in the audience, just have one follow-up point to John Britton's comment about the housing claim in Sheffield O'Neill. Yes, we dropped it as a tactical kind of move, but the claim is still alive. It's not one of those legal moves that bars you from ever making the claim again. It's alive and well and sitting there waiting for someone to bring it. So I just want to make that clear. The fact that no one has done that is a number of reasons for that, but it's still out there. And of course, you know, Connecticut is one of those states where local towns have no inherent zoning and land use powers whatsoever. It's all delegated by the state legislature. And so the real culprit here, I mean, I know we're talking about individual towns and all of the strategies and schemes they employ to keep affordable housing out, but it's really the state that's responsible for this pattern of laws that we see. The state is giving towns the ability and really encouraging them to exclude. And I think what happened in the legislature recently, which I know you're going to get to later, is an example of how the legislature really protects towns' ability to exclude. So anyway, I wanted to make that little legal footnote to John's excellent presentation. So you know, the spillover effect, you know, I think your equivalent Fair Housing Center out in Cleveland just did a great parallel report to yours that looks specifically at the effect of exclusionary zoning on all of the school districts around Cleveland. And it really underscores the point that exclusionary zoning is about keeping lower income kids out of suburban schools. And, you know, one of the ways that perpetuates itself has been studied recently by a lot of scholars. It's about the way that higher income exclusionary towns attract higher and higher income families, attracted by high performing schools with high test scores, which of course is a reflection of the demographics of the kids in those schools. That pushes housing prices up in those towns, leads to higher tax revenue, more investment in the schools, a cycle of increasing test scores and increasingly higher housing prices, keeping even middle-class families out of those towns. That's one of the major drivers in this country of income separation, the way that we're dividing across income lines. And the studies that have been done have shown that school district boundaries are the major driver of income segregation in this country. And of course, that's very much aligned with racial segregation as well. You know, the effect on cities, it's the exact opposite. You know, it's the loss of middle class and upper class families being drawn into the allegedly higher performing school districts, the loss of tax revenue, the increased costs and burdens faced by the school district and the city, higher tax rates for residents less able to pay for them, and the impact of the schools is often, you know, higher poverty rates in the schools. And I think, you know, one of the claims that we were making way back in the day in Chef has been now documented beyond any reasonable doubt that, you know, low-income kids do better in lower poverty, more diverse schools. It's very hard to succeed in a high poverty school. It's a much bigger challenge, and it's hard to find those schools. I mean, we have to invest in them as much as we can, because that's where kids are going to school, and we have to really, you know, and I think what President Biden is doing with Title I is really important, just pouring money into those schools to raise them up, especially after COVID. But ultimately, in the long run, we can't keep putting low-income kids of color in separate schools. And that's what exclusionary zoning is doing to our urban school districts. So those are some, I think, some of the key spillover impacts, as you call it, of exclusionary zoning.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And it goes to one of the questions that just got put in the chat and we can come back to later as well. I want to just wrap up our discussion with the panel before moving on to questions coming in from attendees with, I guess, really a two-part question. One is, what are your thoughts about solutions? And then any other points about zoning that you want to make that we haven't talked about so far. And John, we'll start with you.
I just wanted to add one more footnote, like Phil, to a live action ripe and ready to go in Connecticut. And that is to challenge the basis of funding public education on the property tax assessments and revenue of towns. In a follow-up to the Shep case, we almost went to the front door of the court to file a suit on behalf of a number of municipalities like the Hartfords and Bridgeports, but also like the Middletowns and the New Londons and the Norwalks and the Stanfords. And we were going to sue the state of Connecticut based upon the inequality of relying on the property tax, which created disparities in funding for education and equality in education. And just before we got ready to file the suit, Mayor John DeStefano from New Haven, who was the leading mayor among all mayors who were bringing this suit with private counsel, including some pro bono law firms and myself. And we lost the momentum in the action. We lost the organizer who was going to bring it. But that's still a ripe suit in Connecticut in challenging these conditions of housing segregation and in school segregation with the reliance on the property tax and the inequality of property wealthy school districts and towns and property poor towns.
Absolutely. That's you know, I think the connection to schools is a lot of what is driving this. John, did you want to say, did you want to make any other points about zoning solutions in particular, or should I move along?
You move on along and let me share it with my other excellent panelists.
Okay, sounds good. Cheryl, do you have thoughts about solutions and next steps? You've shared a little, I think.
Yes, and I would default to what's in our report. We have a page of recommendations there, which is, you know, I'll just say a couple of them: to allow housing vouchers to be used in any Connecticut town, to take away some of the unreasonable restrictions related to setbacks and parking and zoning laws that only allow for single family dwellings and not multifamily dwellings, or limit affordable housing to, you know, one-person units and at the exclusion of families with children. I think that a part of allowing this portability is to reinvest into some of the low-income communities. Housing is so inextricably linked to schooling, and it is an issue, and I think it's one that in order to move forward, there's a lot of unpacking that has to be done, because I too went to a predominantly white school, suburban school, and while there were opportunities, there were also threats, because there was a lack of education, and no one was prepared for me or the other, you know, 4 or 5 people of color to be there in some ways. And so this is a multifaceted issue, and in finding a solution, I think that we have to address all of it. And the time is now. I think that our commission, being the state governmental agency responsible for civil rights enforcement, has to take action. I think that we have to really seriously, which is why we did this report and released this report, and are looking forward to dissecting the report that your group did, Aaron, because we may have to, do commission initiated complaints. Our first priority, of course, is education. We don't want to be litigious if we don't have to be. We want to educate and try to get voluntary change. And that is one of the options that we have available. So that is the direction we're moving in. And it is one of collaborating with like-minded organizations to create change, real change for the families and the communities who are being adversely affected by exclusionary zoning.
Fantastic. Phil, can you talk about your thoughts about solutions?
Well, I think one thing this I think been mentioned is, people need to speak up if you're in an exclusionary town. I think sometimes elected officials hear from the loudest voices and get the sense that there's a monolithic NIMBYism going on. And I think it's really important for them to hear multiple voices to sort of break down that suburban monolithic feeling. Not just planning and zoning officials and town council people, but also state representatives and senators, on some of these state legislative issues. I think that's really crucial. Another thing is, I think one thing that pops out of this report again and again is, this sort of theme of racial exclusion, which is really at the root of exclusionary zoning, is obviously very hidden, and it's very hidden in deep history, and it's hidden in its impacts without being spoken of, and it's likely that a lot of people who are implementing zoning laws are not thinking about race at all, necessarily. But the discrimination against families with children is much more out in the open. And that's something which is prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. It's extraordinary, some of the things people say about keeping children out of the town, the cost of having children, we have to reduce the bedroom size limits that Roger talked about. I think some of this stuff is really like explicit discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, much more easy to point to as a citizen and as a lawyer than this very submerged kind of racial impact that kind of goes back, many decades into history. So I think that's a way of people really to really point out some of the issues here. We're really excluding kids, particularly lower income kids from our town, and that's not fair. It's discriminating against families with children. I would definitely raise that up. But I guess my last point is, on your bill, which was a great bill on fair share. The whole idea of fair share is that towns have no kind of inherent authority to zone just for their own, the benefit of people currently living in the town. They have to zone for the welfare of everyone living in the state and region. They have to zone for their fair share of, reasonable housing needs. The advantage of fair share, when I hear people talk about their concerns about, upzoning, et cetera, they're afraid of losing control of zoning in their town. They're afraid of sort of, runaway development, developers just coming in and making a profit and building wherever they want to. Those kind of concerns about loss of control. The value of the fair share concept is the town gets to decide, the town is required to develop its fair share of affordable housing. It gets to have control over where that housing is going to be located, how it's going to be developed. It just has that goal. And they don't need to develop, necessarily 500 multifamily units, which might be, luxury units or whatever, eating up all their open space. They get to develop 150 affordable units in a more controlled way. So it really gives the towns much more control and also achieves the goal we're all looking for, which is that the towns take their fair share of affordable housing. So, I think that's a real selling point for local officials. Really, like, we can have our cake and eat it too. We can reach our affordable housing goal and yet still have some control over, where multifamily gets built in our community. So I think there's a lot of wisdom behind that approach.
Thank you. And, you know, that approach has actually been floated in the state for a few decades now. You know, I think it's working incredibly effectively in New Jersey, and it's created lots of units, and it's getting towns to really think in exactly the terms you described, Phil. So I think that's partly why we landed on it, is because it's important to look at things that are working. So with that, I would like to turn the program over to questions and invite Roger, our staff attorney, to join us too in responding to them. And I'll start with one that is actually a sort of in a related but somewhat different direction, which is a question posed by Renata Bertodi about who actually gets to participate in these town processes, like developing the plan of conservation and development, like testifying at zoning hearings. You know, if a family is, as she posted, along with multiple kids, maybe working multiple jobs, it's hard to engage in those processes. You know, I think maybe where this is going is it says something about how our state civil rights laws need to be actively involved in the process, but I'll also just open it up to other thoughts on that particular question. Any takers?
Sure. Well, I'll answer a little piece of the question, which is who can be involved in some of these processes. You know, we see in every time that you see public participation, be it at planning and zoning commission hearings or in the plan of conservation development, there's a broad cross section of voices that are involved. But there is a tendency, unfortunately, particularly when there are proposals that could implicate areas which have been large lots, single family, and adding density there, for the loudest voices, or maybe the most numerous voices, to be those in opposition to such projects, which is something that we saw, as I noted in the report, even acknowledged by the towns themselves. That said, one thing that was pretty interesting that we saw in a couple of instances was you saw there were big surveys that I think the towns are obligated to do as part of the plan of conservation development process. We did have a couple of towns where they noted that residents were looking for a diversity of housing types. They recognized that there was a shortage, which makes it all the more concerning when there are still impediments in place. So I hope that starts to address the question a little bit.
Definitely. And yeah, and I think we also see, I mean, the other trick about a lot of these processes is that they really are resident focused, even though the need for the housing is regional. So I think that creates some challenges too. Well, here's another question from Robert Hendrick. Can you address the challenges of a lack of infrastructure in pushing for more affordable housing? Towns like Ridgefield, for instance, are difficult to construct, or difficult locations to construct high density projects due to a lack of adequate transportation, highway and public transit that creates demand, and also a lack of municipal water and sewer network that is also key to high density. Zoning alone does not seem to be the solution. How do towns make affordable housing feasible to build, develop from an infrastructure standpoint? And what is the role of the state? And I mean, one thing that's at play here, I think, is some infrastructure money may be coming from the federal government. So that might be one thing worth mentioning.
Yeah, and I was going to say that we have a lot of money being poured into the state of Connecticut, and it needs to be used for infrastructure. It needs to be used for developing a more useful transportation system from areas that were not previously, occupied and not as dense as we intend them to be, so that there can be this portability and housing option for people. So it involves, it should require state involvement, funding from the state, and the use of federal funding for this purpose. We have to prioritize the needs of the state. And I think that this is a need that needs to be prioritized. And I think that it requires some legislative action, obviously, as well, that people have to contact, their senators and representatives and say, this is important. This is at the top of our list of the bills that we want introduced and that we want passed.
Well, and I would add that the last time I looked into this, I think a big contributor to where sewer lines were located had to do with whether or not the town was requesting sewer lines to be located and funding for the sewer lines to be allocated to the town. One of the really great contributions of this new report you just released is looking at the role of the plan of conservation and development that is kind of behind the local zoning law. And the way that's related to the state plan of conservation and development. There's a lot of exclusion built into those plans, and those plans oftentimes govern, where things like sewers get located. So it's not like a naturally occurring event that Ridgefield may not have a lot of sewers. It's about planning and decisions that have been made. And oftentimes people equate sewers with density, and so they don't want them. I don't know if that's what happened in Ridgefield, but it's very common if you look at that sort of relation. In other parts of the country, not so much Connecticut, but in other parts of the country, you see public transit lines stopping at the city limit, right? And in the same way, sewer lines often stop at the border of an exclusionary zoning area. So, sure, it's an issue. Modern septic systems can handle density. It's not something which is like required for multifamily housing. You don't have to have sewers, but I agree that there's an interesting correlation between where towns put sewers and where they don't, and towns that refuse them altogether.
There are also instances of towns having an area that is sewered and then having just a line that goes out to the school, skipping all of the housing in between. So there are also opportunities where that can happen, or even opportunities to build off of that kind of sewer extension that could be helpful. So the next question is there are some questions I'm skipping if they're very specific to particular places, or if I'm not quite sure I'm understanding them. But here's a question about what incentives have actually worked in other towns. We allow multi-family housing in a variety of zones, and I guess this is one particular town, encourage including workforce housing units. We want to add affordable housing, but we have little in town. We have little town-owned land to develop, so that we can, use directly. We have a workforce unit percentage requirement in one zone and increased density incentives in other zones, but developers just say no. We are discussing other possibilities, incentives, but are not sure what is enough and still within the ability of our town to offer. So, I think that the question is sort of about what has worked elsewhere. And to me, that brings, I'm looking beyond Connecticut, that brings me back to fair share. But I don't know, any other folks have examples of, processes that are working elsewhere, either in Connecticut or in the country?
I would just note that the report contains numerous examples of towns which are making efforts in certain regards, such as with regards to senior housing or to extremely low scale multifamily. I mentioned during my presentation that there actually is a fair amount of two-family housing, for example, in Southbury. And what I think those all speak to is that a fundamental impediment is the more rules that you put on housing, the more every other box that needs to be ticked, the harder it is going to be to create it. So part of, I think, and sometimes this can even be perhaps well-intentioned with certain requirements that amounts of units be affordable. Though that can raise questions of financial feasibility, depending on how small, if other restrictions are in play, like only a certain amount of housing can be built, and it has to be a certain percentage, and it could only be on lots of a certain size. These all can reinforce. So I would just say that, you know, a fundamental rule is the easier you make it, the less it's going to cost, and the more you're probably going to get.
Absolutely. So here's a question that is really focused on shelters that are helping people who are homeless and then trying to rehouse them, I think, and basically saying to clients of the shelter that there's no real choice in where they live except to move to New Haven, for example. And I know there's a lot baked into that, but does anyone want to kind of pull that apart a little bit? I think vouchers are probably involved. So does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think that for a homeless family, the highest priority is getting into stable housing, period. And I think it may be, families should have a choice of where they live. But I think, if you're talking about a policy, I think it's really, you have to look at the family's needs and what their immediate needs are. And I think oftentimes the families that I see in our work around the country, take advantage of, these more broader geographic choices are families that are, generally already housed or, not in that precarious position as a family who's in shelter. I don't know if that's completely responsive, but I think, the challenges of homelessness are, related to this conversation, obviously, but I think require somewhat different approaches.
One other theme that I've seen in some of the questions here is that, there's a concern about what happens in schools, what happens for kids who move into new communities that maybe kids of color moving into predominantly white communities. What does that mean both for the new kids and for the kids who are already in the schools? Can anyone sort of address that?
Well,
Cheryl.
Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Cheryl.
I think what happens is that there is going to be an effect without education, that there has to be some cultural humility and cultural competency training, that the teachers need to be trained, the administration needs to be trained, there needs to be some almost human decency training, because like I said, I went through this experience personally, but it's not unlike other experiences I've had throughout my entire life. When I was going to practice before a judge, all the white attorneys who came into the room were asked, were greeted, and I was asked if I was there to hold the bags by a judge. So there is this, if you're a person of color, your life can constantly be interrupted by racism and discrimination and systemic racism and discrimination. And so students who are either low income and so don't have the same, ability to purchase the clothing and the shoes and all the stuff that everyone's wearing or whatever it is important, or kids who are of color, because we've had cases where kids were like sat in the basement because they were being bussed into a particular town, and we've had, cases where kids were sat at the back of the class because they were being, being bussed into town. All of those things have to be broken down, and because that can destroy a child. And so, as we're talking about, desegregation, which is important, and portability, there also has to be, I saw in the chat, someone was, asking about the education component and what is necessary. There have to be programs in the schools to directly deal with the fallout. We can't just send kids into these environments, because it will be harmful for both kids. It'll be harmful for the kids, the white kids in the schools that they're being sent to, and the kids of color who are being sent to the schools, especially if the adults are not appreciating what is happening.
Yeah, that's very true. Back when I was looking at this with the open choice program in the Hartford region, some suburban school districts did a really great job. And some others, which I will remain nameless, had real issues, right? And they needed the training. And a lot of times it was about the leadership at both the district level and the school level, as to how that went with, so, that's hard work. It needs to happen. It takes all the things you said, but it's not inevitable, I think. Some things are going to happen anyway, but a lot can be addressed by good leadership in the schools, and we saw that in the Hartford, in some of the better districts in the Hartford region.
Yeah, no, and we and sometimes the districts that are doing it well might surprise you a little bit. We've definitely had clients who have raved about Simsbury's. They're Black and Latino students really excited about their experience in the Simsbury Public Schools. So I'm going to give a shout out to Simsbury. But I think that's really a lesson. And I know Simsbury has done the work. Like they have spent time and had some real leadership on that. And so I think that goes to your point, Phil, and really backs it up. I think that's absolutely true. So we are coming to the end of our program. I don't know if any of the panelists want to just take a last 30 seconds to have some last words. I'll start with John.
Okay. And applaud Latrice Lacey, all the way from Davenport, Iowa, in this discussion tonight. And she was talking about how the town officials went about changing multifamily units. And she asked, what do you suggest for areas like this? And I suggest looking at our host organization, the Open Communities Alliance, and to use agitation. As the late John Lewis said, you got to make a little trouble, make a little good trouble with public policy advocacy and with creating kinds of community groups and looking at backing electing officials related to how zoning board members are selected. But you must get a little social action going in order to get attention and to try and exert your political power.
All right, Cheryl, over to you.
I'll take my 30 seconds to say thank you for this opportunity for the commission to be heard. And I think that we are really excited about working with you further, and that we want to take some real action. I agree with Professor John Britton that we have to have some good trouble in order to make some real change. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. I'm going to go to Phil, and then Roger, just get ready. I'm giving you the last word.
Well, thanks for having me. We really appreciate it. And I would just say, I want to thank the audience, I guess, because I've been reading not just this excellent chat, but also the questions in the Q&A are terrific. So I hope you're saving all of these and incorporating them into your thinking going forward. It's some great stuff.
Absolutely. And actually, there'll be a survey that comes out immediately after this. So we would really appreciate your feedback, because it's going to help us decide how we move forward with our next discussion. And for a final word, over to Roger, who I have to say, I have to just give some credit to Roger here, who I think this is like birthing a baby for Roger, and also Sam Giffen, who's on our staff, but Roger has taken it to the finish line. So Roger, thank you for all of your work on this. It's been stupendous.
Well, it's an honor. I mean, the fact that I got a last word with the panel of this caliber is that's the most humbling experience maybe of my life. I want to echo the sentiments that have been expressed about how great it is to read in the commentary people really from all over the country trying to really wrestle with these issues and think proactively. And in response to one question, which was about the educational piece, and this is going along with the good trouble theme, we can't address a problem if we don't recognize it as a state. And unfortunately, there are, in the planning documents that we reviewed as part of this report, there are instances of perhaps turning a bit of a blind eye towards the extent of the problem, be the problem segregation, be the problem how you are facilitating or not facilitating housing. And it is, I think, our hope here at the Open Communities Alliance that conversations like this can help to make it so that we all collectively are thinking forward about how we can change that situation and make all of the opportunities of this great state shared by all of our communities.
Thank you. And really, thanks again to all of our panelists. We're so grateful for your time tonight and all of the attendees. I know we didn't get to every single question, but please, we will keep track of them. Please fill out the survey. Please join our coalition. And if you're not ready to join the coalition and you want to have further conversations, we would really welcome those too. So thank you, and we hope to see you in person or virtually very soon. Bye-bye.